Welcome to Lamenting Souls of the Past. If you find solace in these narratives, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell, lest you miss a single chapter of our unfolding chronicles. We would also be honored to know the land or city from which you lend your ear, and which historical tapestry you yearn for us to illuminate. Should you not yet have joined our fellowship, I urge you to do so, for within our communal sphere, intriguing tales previously veiled from the public eye have come to light. Let us now embark upon our story. In the suffocating summer of 1856, deep within the heart of rural Texas, an unspeakable event transpired, which the enslavers, with chilling casualness, merely termed the race. It was no contest of skill, no feat of athleticism. Rather, it was a massacre, meticulously scheduled, a bloody spectacle for affluent men whose lives of luxury, built upon the torment of others, had grown tedious. Once each year, beneath the shroud of the new moon for 3 successive nights, planters from across the southern states would converge upon Blackwater Plantation, their coffers brimming with gold, their souls devoid of humanity. The rule was stark and brutal. 10 enslaved men were cast into the swamp at 9 o'clock in the evening. At 9:15, the hunters embarked upon their pursuit, white men astride horses, armed with rifles, flanked by hounds trained to rend human flesh. The wagering commenced weeks in advance. How long would the swiftest endure? How many remains would be reclaimed by dawn? Which master possessed the most unyielding chattel? None had ever emerged from the Blackwater race alive. In its 7-year span, 70 black men had been thrust into that watery inferno. 70 men had perished, shot, drowned, torn asunder by dogs, or simply swallowed by the treacherous mud and the encroaching night. Their bodies nourished the alligators, their names forgotten before the rising sun. And the following morning, as house slaves scrubbed the blood from their masters' boots, life on the plantations resumed its callous rhythm as if no atrocity had occurred. But in the 8th year, a tremor of change stirred. Among the 10 men shackled in the Blackwater Plantation yard that June night, there was one whom the other enslaved people simply called Abel. His back bore the cruel cartography of 200 lashes. His eyes had borne witness to the severance of his wife and children, sold to far-flung plantations. His hands knew naught but toil and anguish. Yet his mind had for months been a clandestine forge, hammering out a scheme beyond the darkest imaginings of any enslaver. To sharpen their bloodlust, Abel gazed to sharpen their bloodlust. Abel gazed upon the 9 men beside him, and they in turn returned his gaze, for a silent understanding passed between them. This night would unfold differently. This night, the hunters would become the hunted. Before we delve deeper into this harrowing narrative, I invite you to share the city from which you are observing this tale, and do not neglect to subscribe, lest you miss the subsequent chapters. Let us continue. Blackwater Plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of untamed East Texas wilderness, where towering pine forests yielded to cypress swamps, and the very earth seemed to guard ancient secrets within its dark waters. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited this dominion from his father, along with 147 human beings he regarded as mere livestock. But the colonel had grown weary of the cotton and tobacco. He yearned for a stimulation more profound than profit margins and harvest ledgers. It was then that he conceived of the race. The inaugural year, 1849, saw its inception almost by chance, a drunken wager between Whitmore and 3 neighboring planters concerning whose enslaved people could navigate the swamp with the greatest swiftness. By the 2nd year, whispers had traversed the entire South. Wealthy gentlemen journeyed from as distant as Charleston and New Orleans, bringing their finest steeds, their deadliest weapons, and their most expendable property. The event became a legend within the shadowy domain of the plantation elite, murmured in hushed tones within gentlemen's clubs, debated over cigars and brandy, yet never uttered in polite society or in the presence of northern abolitionists. The swamp itself was an ideal stage for this grim purpose. 2 miles deep and 3 miles wide, it was a labyrinth of black water, gnarled cypress knees, treacherous quicksand, and predators, both reptilian and insectoid. A man could vanish within its depths and never resurface. Many had. Yet, while Colonel Whitmore believed he orchestrated every facet of his depraved game, he had committed one profound miscalculation. He was convinced that the men he consigned to that swamp were broken, utterly vanquished, too terrified and exhausted to conceive of anything beyond their own fleeting survival. He never once imagined they could strategize. He never considered they might communicate. He never dreamed they could organize. And he certainly never suspected that his own house slaves, those he entrusted to serve his meals and polish his boots, were woven into the very fabric of the conspiracy. 3 months before the 8th annual race, Abel had been sold to Blackwater Plantation for $800. He arrived in chains, his body emaciated from weeks upon the auction circuit, his spirit supposedly shattered by the wrenching loss of his family. Colonel Whitmore considered it a shrewd acquisition, a prime field hand at nearly half the customary rate of $1,500 for a healthy male slave in his late 20s. Abel's reputation as a provocateur had significantly depressed his market value. He had attempted escape twice before from his previous plantation in Louisiana, apprehended on both occasions and subjected to 100 lashes each time, the scars crisscrossing his back like a brutal cartography of resistance and defiance. What the colonel remained ignorant of was that Abel had gleaned invaluable lessons from those failed attempts at flight. He had learned patience. He had learned to observe, to listen, to amass intelligence while feigning defeat and despair. And most critically, he had learned that freedom achieved in solitude was no freedom at all, not when it entailed abandoning brothers and sisters to their bondage. Not when one's own liberation was predicated upon the continued suffering of others who had aided, sheltered, and safeguarded one's secrets. On his 3rd day at Blackwater, while toiling in the cotton fields beneath the merciless June sun, which rendered the air thick as treacle, Abel overheard 2 overseers discussing the race. They spoke with casual detachment, chuckling about the previous year's spectacle, about how the betting pool had swollen to $20,000 in gold coin and banknotes, about how one man had traversed almost a mile before the dogs overtook him and tore open his legs, about how another had attempted to conceal himself beneath the water in a hollow cypress and drowned from staying submerged too long. The overseers found it all immensely diverting, slapping their thighs and wiping tears of laughter from their eyes. They even recounted how Colonel Whitmore himself had garnered $4,000 on a wager that no enslaved person would survive past midnight, proving once more that the colonel knew his property better than anyone. Abel uttered not a word. He kept his head bowed, his hands moving with unwavering rhythm through the cotton bolls, filling his sack with the white fiber that underpinned Southern fortunes. But his mind was a whirlwind of activity, calculating, remembering every syllable. That evening, within the slave quarters, a cluster of crude wooden cabins behind the main house where the enslaved population existed in conditions barely fit for beasts, Abel sat in silence while the other men and women consumed their meager rations of cornmeal and salt pork. The portions were meticulously measured to provide merely sufficient sustenance to sustain their labor, yet never enough to quell the constant, gnawing hunger. He listened intently to their conversations, discerning names, kinship, hierarchies, the invisible social architecture that persisted beneath the brutal veneer of plantation life. There was Samuel, a man of immense stature who served as the plantation blacksmith, valued at no less than $2,000 for his specialized acumen in metalwork and repair. There was Moses, agile and astute, who tended the colonel's horses, among them a thoroughbred stallion esteemed at $3,000 imported from Kentucky. There was Isaiah, who had endured at Blackwater longer than any other, 15 years of unbroken servitude that had left him gaunt yet acutely observant, his value diminished to perhaps $500 due to age and visible exhaustion. There was Caleb, young and robust at 22 years, acquired but months earlier from an Alabama plantation for $1,200, his youth and vigor rendering him invaluable for the most arduous field work. There was Ruth, one of the house slaves, who cleansed the colonel's study and inadvertently overheard conversations the white men deemed private. Her worth was appraised at $1,000, despite her clandestine ability to read and write, skills she meticulously concealed, for literacy in an enslaved person was deemed a perilous endowment. Abel observed them all with meticulous care. He spoke little during those initial weeks, cultivating an image of quiet obedience and docility, never attracting undue scrutiny. He labored diligently, voiced no grievance, never met the gaze of white men directly, executing every task with mechanical precision. The overseers gradually relaxed their vigilance around him, convinced that the scourging at his former plantation had at last fractured whatever defiant spirit he once possessed. They ceased their close surveillance, curtailed their frequent inspections, and this precisely was Abel's design. Invisibility was a species of liberty, the freedom to observe without being observed, to plan without being suspected. It was Ruth who first approached him. She came to his cabin on a moonless night 2 weeks after his arrival, gliding silently through the darkness like a wraith. Abel lay upon his crude straw mattress, gazing at the ceiling through the fissures in the wooden planks when her shadow materialized in his doorway. The cabin was scarcely 10 feet square, with walls that failed to quite meet the roof and a dirt floor that transformed into mire with the rains. 6 men slept there, packed in tightly. But that night, Abel was alone, for the others labored on a night shift in the sugar house. "Are you devising something?" she whispered. It was not a query, but a pronouncement of fact. Abel remained motionless, uncertain if this was a snare. House slaves sometimes reported to the master in exchange for minor concessions: an extra morsel of meat, a warmer blanket, a day free from toil. The masters lauded them as good slaves and rewarded their perfidy, while the other enslaved people bestowed upon them an altogether different appellation. Ruth seemed to intuit his thoughts. "I am no informant. I have endured 6 years here. I have witnessed 3 races. I have seen 30 men vanish into that swamp, 30 men who never returned. One of them was my brother. Daniel was his name. He was 16 years. The dogs seized him within the first hour. I heard his cries from the main house, where I was serving brandy to the men who gambled on his duration." Abel slowly sat upright in the faint starlight that filtered through the gaps in the cabin walls. He could now clearly discern her countenance, the hatred blazing in her eyes like embers, the same hatred he bore within his own breast, a perpetual burden. "I overheard the overseer speaking of you," Ruth continued, her voice barely audible even in the profound silence. "They said you twice attempted to flee from the merchant plantation in Louisiana. They said you endured 100 lashes each time and uttered no cry, pleaded for no mercy, remained unbroken. They said you are either the most audacious fool they have ever encountered, or the most perilous. I believe you are perilous, and I believe you are planning something for the race." Abel scrutinized her for an extended moment, weighing the immense risk. Then he nodded once, slowly, committing himself to trust. For without trust, there could be no scheme, no resistance, no glimmer of opportunity. "The colonel keeps his firearms in a cabinet within his study," Ruth divulged swiftly, as if she had yearned for months to impart this intelligence. 6 rifles, 4 pistols, all loaded and primed. The key hangs upon a hook behind his desk, directly adjacent to his father's portrait. Each night after supper he consumes a bottle of bourbon, sometimes 2 if the day has been propitious. By 10 o'clock he can scarcely walk aright. The overseers engage in card games in the barn until midnight, imbibing corn whiskey and wagering pocket money. There are 12 dogs in the kennel, but only 1 handler sleeps nearby in a small room appended to the kennel, and he has been deaf in his left ear from a hunting mishap 5 years past. Abel felt a stir within his breast, a sensation he had not known in years. Hope. Dangerous, treacherous hope, capable of leading one to ruin if embraced too ardently, yet also the sole element that rendered survival worthwhile. "How many others are aware?" he inquired softly. "Samuel knows, Moses knows. Isaiah has spoken of it for years, but he never found one willing to lead, none so mad as to attempt it. There are others too, people who labor in the house, people who traverse the property, perhaps 10, 12 souls in total who would lend their aid if they believed a true chance existed. We have been waiting for someone such as you." Over the ensuing weeks, Abel moved with deliberate caution across the plantation, establishing contact with each individual Ruth had named. They convened in small cadres, never more than 3 at a time, always in disparate locations to prevent the formation of any discernible pattern. In the blacksmith shop, where the clang of hammer on anvil muffled their whispered colloquies. In the tobacco drying barn, where the dense leaves absorbed sound and forged shadowy alcoves. In the cistern behind the kitchen, where the splash of drawn water masked their hushed voices. Each meeting was concise, purposeful, dedicated to amassing intelligence and cultivating trust. Samuel, the blacksmith, proved indispensable to their design. He was a man of profound contemplation despite his imposing physique, one who had dedicated years to working with metal and fire, understanding the malleability and transformative potential of matter. He began to set aside pieces of scrap iron, secretly fashioning them into crude yet effective armaments. A blade affixed to a wooden handle, capable of piercing flesh. A spike that could be driven through bone. Lengths of chain that could strangle or serve as bonds. He worked with unhurried precision, never appropriating so much material as to arouse suspicion, never toiling on the weapons when under observation. Over 8 weeks, he amassed sufficient weaponry for 10 men, concealing them in 3 distinct locations across the property, interred in oilcloth to thwart rust, positioned for swift retrieval when the moment arrived. Moses meticulously studied the horses and the plantation's layout with an expert eye. He had ministered to animals since childhood, comprehending their temperament, their anxieties, their instincts. He reported that the colonel possessed 8 horses, all housed in the main stable near the residence. The thoroughbred stallion alone was worth more than any 3 enslaved people combined, and the colonel guarded it with zealous possessiveness, personally inspecting it each evening. But the other horses were frequently left unattended after dark, their stable doors closed but unlatched. The prevailing assumption being that no enslaved person would dare attempt to abscond with a horse, as the penalty was death by hanging. Moses also charted the swamp's ingress points, distinguishing which paths led to quicksand and which offered relatively safe passage. Information gathered over years of retrieving game birds shot by the white men during hunting expeditions. He knew where the water was shallow enough for wading and where it plunged abruptly to depths of 8 or 10 feet. He knew which cypress trees possessed roots sturdy enough to stand upon and which concealed sinkholes that would swallow a man whole. Isaiah, despite his advanced years and profound exhaustion, despite the tremor in his hands from decades of brutal labor, proved to possess the most acute memory Abel had ever encountered. He recounted every minute detail of the preceding 7 races, describing the precise timing, the hunters' positions, the routes the fleeing men had taken. He recalled that the hunters invariably divided into 3 groups, one circling left along the swamp's perimeter, one circling right, and one driving straight through the center in a wedge formation. He remembered that the dogs were always unleashed first, always from the eastern side of the swamp, where the terrain was firmest, permitting them to gather speed. He remembered that the colonel himself never ventured into the swamp, choosing instead to observe from a raised platform near the starting point, a wooden edifice approximately 8 feet high that afforded him an unobstructed view of the initial chase. From that platform, he collected wagers from latecomers and dispersed winnings to those whose predictions regarding survival times and methods of demise had proven accurate. Last year's race had attracted 17 plantation owners, with a betting pool of $23,000 in gold and banknotes, the largest sum yet amassed for the event. Ruth continued her service in the main house, privy to every conversation, perusing every letter carelessly left upon the colonel's desk, observing the rhythms and routines of the white family and their guests. She ascertained that this year's race was slated for June 15th, 16th, and 17th during the new moon, when darkness would reign supreme, rendering the hunt most formidable. She learned that invitations had been dispatched to planters across 5 states, each hand-delivered by trusted servants. She discovered that the colonel had boasted to his peers about acquiring fresh stock, including a troublemaker from Louisiana who was sure to provide exciting sport, a clear allusion to Abel himself. She also learned that the entry fee for hunters had been elevated to $500 per night, with all proceeds augmenting the prize pool, making this year's event potentially the most lucrative to date. The colonel anticipated this year's race to be the grandest yet, perhaps drawing 30 participants in a betting pool exceeding $40,000. But most crucially, Ruth learned something the colonel had idly mentioned over dinner one evening, something he deemed utterly insignificant, yet which utterly transformed Abel's meticulous planning. This year, for the very first time, the colonel intended to permit the chosen enslaved men to spend the afternoon preceding the race unchained, to allow them to nurture hope before summarily crushing it in the swamp. He believed this psychological torment would heighten the spectacle, that men who spent hours contemplating potential escape routes would run with greater urgency, fight with greater desperation, providing a superior exhibition for the paying audience. The concept had originated from one of his guests the previous year, a Mississippi plantation owner who claimed extensive expertise in manipulating slave psychology for optimal performance. When Ruth conveyed this to Abel, he smiled for the first time since his arrival at Blackwater. It was not a smile of pleasure, nor of happiness or joy, but the smile of a man who had just been presented with the very key to his adversary's undoing. That, he stated quietly, is when we make our move. The plan gradually took form over the succeeding weeks, refined through dozens of whispered colloquies, tested against every conceivable contingency they could imagine. Where the treacherous terrain and trained hunters afforded every advantage to the white men. Instead, they would invert the entire event, transforming the hunters into the hunted, leveraging the pandemonium and darkness to their benefit, and retaliating with a ferocity that would reverberate across the South for generations. Yet they required more than mere weapons and precise timing. They needed individuals willing to embrace death if necessary, willing to contend against impossible odds, willing to sacrifice individual survival for collective retribution. They needed men who had arrived at a juncture where death held no terror, for life had become indistinguishable from it, where the only remaining choice was between perishing like an animal or falling like a warrior. Abel personally approached each candidate, usually late at night, always in absolute privacy. Caleb was the first. The young man from Alabama had been selected for the race, chosen for his youth and vigor, qualities the colonel believed would ensure a thrilling spectacle, a man who would run swiftly and far before being brought down. When Abel unveiled the plan in its entirety, withholding nothing, Caleb's eyes widened with a complex blend of fear and something else, something that resembled hunger. "You speak of slaying white men," Caleb whispered, the words barely forming upon his lips. "They will pursue us eternally. They will slaughter everyone on this plantation. They will create an example that will be remembered for a century." "They are going to kill us anyway," Abel responded with serene calm, stating it as an unvarnished truth. "You have been chosen for the race. Do you comprehend what that signifies? You possess perhaps one chance in 100 of witnessing the sunrise, and that only if fortune smiles upon you. Most men endure no longer than 2 hours. The record stands at 3 hours and 40 minutes, established 3 years ago by a man named Joshua who almost reached the western edge before the dogs cornered him against a ravine. They say he fought the dogs with his bare hands for 15 minutes before a hunter shot him in the head. That is the zenith of anyone's achievement. 3 hours and 40 minutes of terror before oblivion. Is that the death you desire?" Caleb remained silent for an extended moment, his hands trembling faintly. Then he slowly nodded. "I would rather perish fighting than perish running. I would rather claim some of them with me than merely be their diversion." Abel discovered a similar resolve in the others. There was Thomas, a field hand who had watched his wife sold away 3 years prior, her price of $900 used to settle the colonel's gambling debts after an ill-fated night of cards in New Orleans. Thomas had endeavored to purchase her freedom, had implored the colonel to sell him instead, had offered to labor double shifts for the remainder of his days. The colonel had merely laughed in his face, then sold the woman to a brothel in Mobile. There was Benjamin, whose arms bore scars from a punishment that had entailed holding hot coals for speaking insolently to an overseer, a torture that had permanently disfigured his hands, diminishing his monetary value, but not his consuming hatred. There was Elijah, whose son had been beaten to death at the tender age of 12 for purloining an apple from the colonel's orchard. His small body held no value in the plantation ledgers. His murder was recorded simply as disposed of damaged property, without further elucidation or consequence. There was Marcus, torn from his mother at age 8 and sold at auction in Charleston for $400, who could still recall her screams echoing his name as he was loaded onto a wagon. There was Joseph, acquired but a year ago for $1,000 after his previous owner faced bankruptcy, who had been a house slave on a relatively comfortable plantation before being cast into the brutal conditions of Blackwater. Each man possessed a story etched in scars and profound loss. Each man had arrived at a point where death held no greater terror than life. Each man was ready. By late May, 10 men had pledged themselves to the plan. They possessed weapons secreted in 3 distinct locations across the property. They held detailed knowledge of the swamp, the patrol timings, the overseer's routines. They had Ruth and 3 other house slaves prepared to assist from within the main house, to drug food if necessary, to unlock doors, to engineer distractions. They had Moses ready to manage the horses, to scatter them at the crucial juncture. They had Samuel poised to breach the locks on the ammunition storage should the opportunity present itself. What they lacked was any assurance that the plan would succeed. Too many variables existed, too many eventualities that could go awry. A solitary betrayal would condemn them all to torture and execution. A single misstep, one moment of hesitation or panic could unravel everything. The chasm between triumph and catastrophic failure was razor thin. Abel lay awake at night, meticulously scrutinizing every detail, seeking vulnerabilities, replaying scenarios in his mind. The weight of responsibility pressed upon him like a tangible burden, akin to carrying another person upon his back. These men entrusted him with their lives, their families, the other enslaved people on the plantation. Everyone stood at risk. If he failed, if the plan disintegrated, the repercussions would be measured in blood and screams. The colonel would orchestrate examples that would be recounted for decades, public torture and execution designed to extinguish any flicker of resistance throughout the South. But if he succeeded, if they truly achieved this feat, they would strike a blow that would reverberate far beyond Blackwater Plantation. They would prove that enslaved people could fight back, could organize, could vanquish their oppressors despite overwhelming odds. They would forge a narrative that would disseminate from plantation to plantation, whispered in fields and cabins, sung in coded spirituals, carrying a message of resistance and hope to thousands who lived bereft of either. On June 1st, Colonel Whitmore made his official selections for the race. He gathered all the male slaves in the main yard, moving among them like a man choosing livestock at market, scrutinizing muscles and teeth, posing questions about stamina and speed. He selected 10 men, calling out their names one by one with casual authority. Abel, Caleb, Thomas, Benjamin, Elijah, Marcus, Joseph, and 3 others who were not privy to the conspiracy, who knew nothing of the plan, Simon, David, and Jacob. Abel's heart plummeted like a stone cast into water. 3 men who knew nothing, 3 men who would succumb to panic when the plan unfolded. 3 men who could ruin everything through ignorance or fear or simple ill fortune. That evening, he approached them separately, assuming an enormous risk. Simon was 35, a taciturn man who had endured at Blackwater for 8 years, who kept to himself and rarely spoke. David was 42, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from an accident in the lumber mill where a saw had claimed his digits, an injury that had diminished his value by $300. Jacob was barely 19, newly purchased for $1,100 from a plantation in Mississippi, still raw from the recent severance from his mother just weeks prior. Abel laid bare everything. He unfolded the entire plan, the weapons, the timing, the coordinated assault, the inherent perils. He elucidated that they faced 2 alternatives: join the conspiracy and grasp a chance at freedom and retribution, or run blindly into the swamp and perish like the 70 men before them, their deaths merely entertainment for affluent men who would consign their names to oblivion before breakfast. Simon listened intently, his face betraying no emotion. Then he posed a single question, his voice steady as iron. "Do you truly believe we can slay them all?" "No," Abel answered with unvarnished honesty, for deception would serve no one now. "No, I believe some of us will perish. Perhaps most of us. Perhaps all of us. But I would rather die striving to take them with me than die fleeing like an animal while they wager on my duration." Simon pondered for a moment, weighing the possibilities. Then he extended his hand, a gesture of solemn accord. "I am resolved," he declared. "For 8 long years have I awaited such a chance." David, a soul aged beyond his years, proved a more formidable challenge. Time and the unyielding lash of brutality had etched caution into his very being, teaching him the bitter lesson of resistance's futility. "Even should we dispatch every soul upon this estate," he murmured, his voice a slow, deliberate cadence, "they will unleash the army. They will loose bounty hunters. They will pursue us to the very borders of Mexico, if such a journey be required. This act they will elevate to a national cause, a testament to the untrustworthiness of the enslaved, a grim validation for even greater cruelties throughout the land." "Perhaps so," Abel conceded. "Most likely. Yet we shall at least perish as men, not as mere chattel. We shall at the very least extract a toll, and somewhere, in the shadowed corners of other plantations, other bondsmen will whisper of our deed, and know that such a reckoning is not beyond reach." David's gaze fell upon his disfigured hand, 2 fingers absent, a perpetual scar branding the callous disregard white men held for black bodies, the effortless ease with which they shattered and debased human lives in their insatiable quest for gain. At last, he gave a solemn nod. "Very well, I shall join. There is, after all, nothing left to forfeit." Jacob represented the gravest hazard. Young and consumed by fear, he yet clung to fragile illusions that obedience might somehow elicit mercy, that the semblance of a dutiful bondsman could procure humane treatment. Yet, within him also smoldered a nascent fury, still raw from the wrenching severance from his mother, sold like mere livestock. Abel wagered upon this ember of rage, upon the unhealed depth of his wounds. "They paid $1,100 for your person," Abel imparted softly. "Do you comprehend its meaning? You are their expensive property, valuable, prime stock. Pursue a deer or a rabbit. Your mother pursue a deer or a rabbit. Your mother parted with you, believing you would at least endure, that you would survive, though she might never again behold your face. Do you wish to betray that hope? to perish for their amusement barely 3 weeks after her farewell? Tears traced a path down Jacob's cheeks, yet his jaw was set with a new resolve. What actions must I now undertake? Their number now stood at 13. 10 who had meticulously charted their course for months, and 3 compelled to instantaneous adaptation. It was not ideal, yet it would needs suffice. The final fortnight unfolded with agonizing deliberation, each day an interminable stretch. The plantation, meanwhile, thrummed with the feverish anticipation of the impending hunt. Carriages, heavy with opulence, commenced their daily arrival, disgorging prosperous gentlemen from every corner of the South. They arrived accompanied by their retinue of servants, their leashed hunting hounds, and their costly rifles nestled within leather cases. The guest chambers of the great house swelled to capacity, spilling over into a canvas encampment upon the lawn, thus forging a fleeting village of affluence and prerogative. Poured from the manor's windows as the guests imbibed and wagered, recounting tales of past pursuits, of bondsmen they had slain, and the macabre spectacle of human suffering. Ruth, while attending to their libations, whispered a name she had chanced to overhear. Richard Beaumont, of New Orleans, a magnate of sugar plantations, his fortune exceeding $200,000, commanded 3 vast estates and held dominion over more than 400 souls. Henry Caldwell, from Alabama, presided over 4 plantations and nearly 600 enslaved individuals. His wealth, amassed through the twin engines of cotton and cruelty, dispensed in equal measure. William Preston, a Georgian gentleman, had claimed $3,000 in the previous year's hunt, having wagered sagaciously that a single bondsman would endure past midnight but fail to greet the dawn. Thomas Ashford, hailing from Mississippi, arrived with a dozen hounds, offering supplemental wagers of $100 per animal on which beast would first taste blood. And Jonathan Reed of South Carolina, proprietor of a slave-trading enterprise, had personally consigned over 15,000 human beings to the auction block throughout his career, sundering families and vending children with the dispassionate efficiency of a cattle merchant. These were no impoverished souls battling for subsistence. These were no desperate men propelled by want. Nay, these were the South's most opulent and potent figures, men who sculpted legislation and swayed governance, men who occupied seats in state legislatures and congressional halls, men who, in their self-proclaimed zenith of civilization, orchestrated human hunts for their amusement. They perceived no discord in offering their devotions in church on Sunday, only to wager on a man's agonizing struggle for survival in a Saturday chase. The wagering pool swelled to an unprecedented sum, eclipsing all prior years. By the 14th day of June, it had amassed $52,000 in glittering gold coins, crisp banknotes, and solemn promissory pledges from financial institutions across the southern states. The colonel, with ostentatious pride, arranged these leather-bound fortunes upon a dedicated table within the grand house, presenting them as trophies for his esteemed guests to behold. $52,000, a fortune beyond the grasp of any bondsman across 10 lifetimes of toil, exceeding the earnings of most free men in 2 decades of labor. All of it staked upon the agony of human suffering. The enslaved individuals toiling within the manor reported a peculiar fervor amongst the guests this year. They whispered of fresh blood and novel sport. They deliberated upon hunting strategies, contested the most advantageous positions, and meticulously compared their armaments. The hounds, meanwhile, were gorged on raw meat, then deliberately starved for 2 days preceding the chase, their primal hunger and aggression thus honed to a fearsome pitch for their impending release. On the dawn of June 15th, the 13 chosen souls were sequestered from their fellow bondsmen and led to a temporary enclosure beside the swamp's murky fringe. True to their word, no chains bound them, though 4 armed overseers maintained an unblinking vigil from a towering platform. They received an augmented portion of sustenance, cornbread, and actual meat, a cruel parody of generosity designed merely to fuel their flight. The white gentlemen coveted a keen contest. They desired not for their quarry to succumb to exhaustion ere the spectacle commenced. Abel seized this precious interval to reiterate the meticulous plan to the others, his voice a low murmur, imperceptible to the guards. They clustered in a pen's farthest corner, their bodies forming a screen, their whispered words snatched by the languid afternoon breeze. Samuel was to station himself near the eastern periphery, where he had secreted 3 iron blades, each swaddled in oilcloth. Moses would steer toward the western flank, close to where the horses were tethered to a rail fence. Thomas and Benjamin would remain conjoined in the heart of the mire, where crude spears, honed from sharpened wood, lay interred beneath a shroud of leaves and mud. The remaining men would disperse into a loose array, each comprehending his particular charge, each prepared to adapt should events unravel, as they almost certainly would. The pivotal juncture would arrive 30 minutes post-release, when the hunters, brimming with hubris, their vigilance relaxed, would penetrate the swamp. The enslaved would not flee in disarray. Instead, they would circle back, traversing paths they had committed to memory over months, establishing positions for ambush, transmutating from hunted to hunter. "They deem us mere beasts," Abel quietly imparted to his companions. "They anticipate our panic, our errors, our swift demise. Such has been their experience these 7 years. Such is their expectation. Therefore, we shall present them with its antithesis. We shall move with deliberation and stealth. We shall employ every fragment of knowledge concerning this swamp, of which they possess none, and when they trespass into our domain, scattered and overconfident, we shall dismantle them, one by one." As twilight draped its mantle over Blackwater Plantation, the guests converged near the designated starting point. Dozens of lanterns cast their glow upon the scene, painting the lawn with long, shifting shadows. The hounds, taut at their leashes, snarled and snapped at the very air, their anticipation a palpable tremor. The hunters, with practiced grace, meticulously inspected their weapons, loading rifles and pistols, calibrating sights, preparing for the impending chase. The colonel, astride his elevated platform, addressed the throng with a pride steeped in whiskey, his voice resonating across the assembled opulence. "Gentlemen," he boomed, his arms spreading wide in a sweeping gesture, "welcome to the 8th annual Blackwater race. This year we present 13 magnificent specimens for your delectation. The wagering pool now stands at $52,000, the grandest in our storied history. As ever, wagers may be placed upon the duration of survival, the distance traversed, or the precise manner of demise. The quarry shall be released precisely at 9. The hunt shall commence at 9:15. May fortune favor the most skillful hunter, and may we all partake of a profitable evening." The multitude erupted in enthusiastic cheers. Funds exchanged hands as final wagers were laid. One man staked $500 that no bondsman would breach the first creek. Another offered $300, confident that the hounds would claim at least 3 lives before a hunter's shot was fired. The atmosphere shimmered with festivity, with celebration, akin to a county fair or a grand holiday assembly. The 13 men were then marshaled to the starting line by overseers, their whips and rifles stark against the fading light. Abel's gaze swept across the assembled white men, their confident visages, their costly attire, the gleam of their weapons beneath the lantern's glow. He etched every detail into his memory. These were the countenances of those who deemed themselves supreme, who believed in their divinely bestowed right to own and to shatter human beings, who had forged their entire civilization upon the principle that some lives held intrinsic worth, while others possessed none. In but a few fleeting hours, Abel mused, some of those faces would be extinguished forever. The colonel raised a pistol high above his head. A hush fell upon the crowd, anticipation thickening the very air. Then he discharged it into the vast sky, the report echoing across the entire domain. The race had begun. The 13 men plunged into the encroaching darkness, their strides carving splashes through the shallow waters at the swamp's periphery. Behind them, the throng roared with a primal fervor. Voices rose, offering fervent exhortations to favored hunters. The hounds howled with desperate longing, straining against their tethers for release. Yet, for precisely 15 minutes, the enslaved would possess a head start, time to establish a crucial distance, time to vanish into the aqueous labyrinth of water and trees. Abel guided the group deeper into the swamp's embrace, yet not with reckless speed. A full-out sprint would swiftly drain their strength, leaving them breathless precisely when silence was paramount. They needed to conserve their vitality and maintain their cohesion. In years past, the enslaved had scattered in disarray, each soul attempting solitary escape, an individualism that had invariably doomed them to isolation and death. 200 paces, then we split, Abel called back to the others, his voice low but imbued with unwavering clarity. Remember the markers. Remember the plan. They had dedicated weeks to mastering this terrain, meticulously engraving every feature upon their minds. That lightning-scarred cypress, a silent sentinel, signified a turn left toward firmer ground. That cluster of rocks promised a fleeting 50 feet of refuge. That patch of luminescent moss forewarned of quicksand capable of swallowing a man whole within minutes. Knowledge, precious and hard-won, was their sole true advantage against the cavalry, the firearms, and the relentless trained hounds. Precisely at 9:15, the second gunshot reverberated. The hunters were nigh. They heard the baying of dogs, the shouts of men exchanging calls, the violent splash of horses entering the water. "Now," Abel hissed. The group fragmented into 4 distinct units, just as planned. Abel himself led Simon, Jacob, and Caleb, circling toward the eastern fringe where Samuel had concealed the weapons. Thomas and Benjamin moved westward with David, making for the wooden spears. Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah journeyed northward, deeper into the swamp's impenetrable heart, where horses dared not tread, where the water rose above a man's head, and cypress roots wove a bewildering maze, traversable only by those possessed of intimate understanding. Each contingent knew its route, its destination, its precise timing. The grand design mandated that all groups would ultimately converge back toward the starting point from divergent directions, sowing confusion, compelling the hunters to believe they pursued fleeing quarry, when in chilling truth, they advanced into carefully orchestrated killing zones. Abel's contingent advanced swiftly through waters that rose to their thighs, cold and black, redolent of decay. They discerned the hunters' voices behind them, shouting coordinates to one another, the hounds baying with an insatiable bloodlust, yet the sounds receded in the wrong direction. The hunters pursued the most obvious trail, the one that plunged deeper into the swamp in a straight, unthinking line. "They believe we flee straight ahead, like all who came before," Caleb murmured, following intuition rather than the dictates of strategy. "Good," Abel replied softly. "Let them harbor the illusion that we are mere animals." They reached the cypress tree, scarred by lightning, and discovered Samuel's hidden cache precisely where it had been secreted: 3 pieces of iron, crudely filed into blades, each approximately 8 inches in length, swaddled in oilcloth to ward off rust. Abel claimed one, savoring the heft in his hand, the rough-hewn metal grip Samuel had fashioned. He entrusted the remaining blades to Caleb and Jacob. Simon chose a heavy branch, thick as a man's arm, which would serve as a formidable club. "Remember our design," Abel instructed quietly, all of them crouching low in the shadows, the water gently lapping at their chests. "We do not engage unless victory is assured. We shall fell stragglers and isolated hunters. We shall shun their grouped numbers. We shall wield the darkness and their own disarray against them." They hunkered down in the water, only their heads breaking the surface, and waited with the profound patience of men who had spent their entire lives in anticipation, understanding that such forbearance was, at times, the sole power granted to the powerless. The first hunter emerged 23 minutes later, a lone figure threading through the gloom. He was young, perhaps 25 years of age, clad in costly riding apparel, now drenched and caked with mud. He bore a rifle whose value likely surpassed the sum of Abel's own sale price. A magnificent weapon, adorned with silver inlay and a gleaming polished stock. He advanced without caution, thrashing through the water, generating noise, utterly convinced of his own security, certain that his quarry lay far ahead, fleeing in terror, not lurking behind him poised for ambush. He never witnessed Abel rise from the water, a ghost made manifest. The iron blade plunged into his back, between the ribs, angling upwards toward the heart. The man attempted to scream, but Abel's other hand clamped over his mouth, stifling the sound. They dragged him beneath the water, holding him fast as his struggles grew faint, as life seeped from his frame, and he became but another fragment of the swamp's dark embrace. His expensive rifle sank into the mire, lost forever. "One," Abel whispered, feeling not elation, but a grim, unyielding satisfaction. This was justice, crude, brutal, yet justice nonetheless. They proceeded with caution, tracing the swamp's edge back toward their starting point. In the distance, gunshots rang out, followed by shouts, tinged with confusion, almost panic. The hunters had stumbled upon something, likely one of the decoy trails the enslaved had meticulously prepared. More confusion, more chaos. Perfect. The second hunter they encountered was older, more seasoned, moving with greater circumspection than the first. He held a pistol in one hand and a lantern in the other, a tactical blunder that annihilated his night vision while blatantly advertising his presence to any watchful eye. Abel permitted him to pass, remaining submerged in the water. Then Simon rose silently behind him, bringing the heavy branch down upon the back of his skull with devastating force. The man crumpled instantly. They salvaged his pistol and lantern, valuable trophies. 2, Caleb counted quietly. From various corners of the swamp, sounds of violence emanated. A dog's sharp yelp, abruptly silenced by something brutal. Men shouting in alarm, their voices shrill with fear. A gunshot, then another, then a profound quietude. The other groups were engaging the hunters, culling them, shattering the choreographed pursuit. Abel's company reached the western edge of the swamp, discovering Moses awaiting them with Thomas and Benjamin. Between them lay 3 fallen hunters and 2 dead hounds, their forms partially submerged in the dark waters. Moses clutched a pistol, wrested from one of the bodies. "The horses?" Abel inquired softly. "Scattered them, precisely as we devised," Moses replied with grim satisfaction. "We severed their tethers, discharged a shot into the air. They bolted in every direction, seized by panic. Some of the white men pursued them on foot, away from the swamp's embrace. Utter pandemonium." This outcome surpassed even Abel's most daring hopes. Greater chaos, deeper confusion, more hunters isolated and vulnerable. "How many have we dispatched in total?" Thomas asked. "At least 7, perhaps more," Moses responded. "Yet they begin to grasp that something is amiss. I heard them attempting to regroup near the center, calling out to one another." "Then we shall strike them while they are gathered," Abel declared. "All of us together. A single, swift assault, then we disperse before they can mount a true defense." They moved through the concealing darkness toward the voices of men calling to one another, voices now imbued with confusion and escalating fear. Indeed, the hunters had convened in a small clearing, perhaps 15 souls among them, lanterns held aloft, their guns aimed at unseen shadows. Fear now gripped them, the stark realization dawning that their entertainment had twisted into a grotesque nightmare. The predators had become the prey, a chilling truth they felt in their very bones. Abel's group silently encircled them, joined by Marcus, Joseph, and Elijah, who emerged from the north like vengeful spirits. 13 bondsmen, now armed with purloined firearms, crude blades, clubs, and stones. 13 men who possessed nothing left to lose, and an entire world to reclaim. They launched their assault from 4 directions simultaneously, a coordinated storm born of desperation, righteous fury, and months of meticulous planning. The gunfire was deafening, its echoes reverberating across the swamp. Men screamed, lanterns shattered, plunging sections of the clearing into abrupt darkness. In the ensuing chaos and bewilderment, the hunters frequently discharged their weapons at one another, as often as at the enslaved. Abel espied the young man from South Carolina, Jonathan Reed, the notorious slave trader who had consigned 15,000 human beings to market, attempting to reload his rifle with trembling hands. Abel's blade found its mark, opening his throat. 15,000 souls, their fate sealed with a single stroke. The conflict endured scarcely 4 minutes, an eternity compressed into fleeting moments of unadulterated violence. When it concluded, 12 more hunters lay dead or dying. The few survivors fled into the suffocating darkness, their courage utterly evaporated, running in blind terror like the very quarry they had sought to pursue. Abel quickly assessed their numbers. They had lost Benjamin, struck through the chest in the initial fusillade. David, his skull fractured by a rifle butt, was also gone. 11 men remained standing, 11 survivors out of 13. "Return to the plantation," Abel commanded, his voice unwavering despite the surge of adrenaline coursing through him, "before they can regroup and marshal a true defense." They navigated the swamp's depths with swift purpose, following paths ingrained in their very souls, every root and moss-covered stone a familiar guide. Behind them, scattered gunfire echoed, men discharging their weapons at phantoms, fear consuming the shattered remnants of the hunting party. When they emerged from the mire, coated in mud and gore, they discovered the plantation in utter pandemonium. Those guests who had not ventured into the swamp now frantically gathered their possessions, poised for flight. Servants scurried in terror. Dogs barked incessantly. The horses that had escaped being scattered were being hastily saddled by trembling hands. The colonel stood upon his elevated platform, attempting to marshal a defense, his face a mottled purple with rage, alcohol, and the dawning horror. "What are you doing?" he shrieked at his guests, his voice cracking with desperation. "They are slaves, merely slaves. We possess firearms, we have superior numbers, we can—" He never completed the utterance. Moses, with unswerving aim, shot him from 30 feet distant. The colonel toppled backward from the platform, crashing into the dirt, his skull shattered, his blood staining the very ground he had once trod upon as a king. What ensued was no mere battle. It was an execution. Brutal and swift and utterly merciless, the enslaved wielded the element of surprise, the searing fire of desperation, an intimate understanding of the estate, and the surging support of over 100 other bondsmen who now perceived their own glorious chance for liberty. The white men, in contrast, were beset by panic, confusion, and a greed that compelled them to prioritize the safety of their valuables over their own defense, coupled with the fatal arrogance of people who had never truly believed the enslaved could retaliate. Some attempted to fight. Some sought to flee. Some endeavored to hide within buildings and root cellars. None succeeded. Ruth and the other house slaves joined the furious fray, seizing knives from the kitchen, heavy candlesticks, iron pokers from the hearth, anything that could serve as a weapon. Samuel breached the weapons cabinet in the colonel's study, distributing rifles to any who could wield them. The plantation slaves, hitherto uninvolved in the clandestine conspiracy, now seized their moment, rising as one. 147 souls, long enslaved and brutalized, now turned upon their oppressors with a generational fury that had simmered for decades. By the stroke of midnight, it was accomplished. 34 white men lay dead. The guests from Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, South Carolina, all the opulent plantation owners who had arrived seeking amusement, the colonel and his overseers, the handlers and supervisors, all met their end. The great house was consumed by fire, flames climbing into the night sky like a fearsome beacon, devouring the grand architecture built with the sweat of bondsmen. The stables burned, the cotton storehouse burned. Smoke and fire transmuted the darkness into a hellish daylight visible for miles. Within the colonel's study, ere the hungry flames devoured it, they discovered the leather satchels replete with $52,000. Abel's gaze lingered upon the money for a prolonged moment, all that gleaming gold and crisp paper, a grim testament to wagers placed upon human suffering. Then he seized one bag and cast it into the heart of the consuming conflagration. "We are no thieves," he declared with resolute firmness. "We are no longer property. We are free people, and free people do not accept blood money." The others, without hesitation, emulated his gesture. $52,000, the vile price of blood sport and human degradation, dissolved into ash and smoke. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with nascent streaks of orange and rose, the survivors congregated in the yard. Of the original 13 designated for the race, 11 yet breathed. Of the other plantation bondsmen, all but a mere handful had weathered the tempest of the uprising. 143 souls, no longer chattel, no longer enslaved, stood united as the sun ascended upon a nascent day. They gathered what provisions they could bear: weapons, foodstuffs, blankets, tools, anything that might prove useful for the arduous journey ahead. All remaining animals were liberated save for the horses, which they would ride in rotating shifts. Then, they departed in small companies, initially moving in disparate directions to confound any immediate pursuit. All, however, were ultimately bound for Mexico and the promise of freedom, leaving in their wake naught but smoke, ruins, and a tale that would sweep across the South like a wild conflagration. The Blackwater race was never again enacted. The estate was eventually seized by the state and offered for auction, yet no one dared to claim it. The legend of what transpired there, of bondsmen rising and slaughtering their masters, rendered it accursed ground. Local inhabitants whispered of screams emanating from the swamp on moonless nights. The buildings stood vacant for years, until at last they succumbed to the ravages of neglect and crumbled. And in the slave quarters across Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and beyond, people spoke in hushed tones of Abel and the night the hunters became the hunted, of the race that culminated in fire, blood, and the fierce embrace of freedom. The narrative grew with each retelling, transforming into both a potent symbol and an enduring inspiration, a stark reminder that oppression could be defied, that the subjugated could retaliate, that even the most powerful could be brought low. Abel and his companions reached Mexico 7 weeks thereafter, having fought their way through relentless pursuit by bounty hunters and militia. Most survived to forge new existences south of the border. Some, in later years, returned after the Civil War, seeking families cruelly sundered by slavery. Others vanished into the annals of history, their fates unknown, their names unremembered, yet their actions forever etched into the collective memory. But the story lived on. And every plantation owner who heard it felt a cold tremor of fear, wondering if their own enslaved might be plotting a similar insurrection, wondering if they, too, might one day face the vengeance they had spent lifetimes accumulating. The Blackwater Massacre claimed 34 white men and liberated a multitude of black souls. The financial detriment, encompassing property, crops, and human assets, surpassed $300,000. Yet the psychological repercussions were incalculable, a profound fissure in the very bedrock of slavery itself. Proof that the system could be shattered by those it sought to crush. And somewhere in Mexico, Abel forged a quiet life. Never did he forget the night he transmuted from prey to predator. Never did he forget the men and women who fought valiantly beside him. Never did he forget that freedom is not bestowed but seized, bought with blood and fire and an absolute, unyielding refusal to accept bondage as destiny.